According to a Paul Simon song, there are 50 ways to dump your lover, but by and large, all of those 50 ways will hurt your lover like hell. That's me, Mike Collins. There's a very important corollary here, because if there are 50 ways to leave your lover, there are also 50 ways to love the one who left you, someone who leaves you, betrays you, hurts you. Did I mean consequence? Probably not. But to quote the great Lewis Carroll, "When I use a word," said Humpty Dumpty in a rather contemptuous tone, "it means only what I choose to signify it, neither more nor less." "The question is," said Alice, "whether words can be made to mean so many different things." "The question is," said Humpty Dumpty, "which one is the master of them, that's all." How did I know that my wife and lover, was thinking of leaving me? She began the process of inadvertently bringing me up to speed by quietly humming or whistling snippets from 50 Ways to Dump Your Lover at random and often not so appropriate moments. All the time, for crying out loud, sometimes even looking at me, but in that special way that people have when they're trying not to be obvious, and thereby making it even more obvious. But the kicker, I thought, happened when we went to an expensive restaurant to celebrate our 5th wedding anniversary, and she hummed this song as we walked through the doors of the restaurant. The restaurant in question? It was a very posh and expensive Italian restaurant on Penfold Street called Mostri Vili. Of course, no expense was spared for the love of my life. The look on her face as we were escorted to our table evoked mixed emotions. Sympathy, a hint of loss, maybe a soupy chuckle. Yes. Unfortunately, there was. But the love wasn't there. It wasn't. I had hoped that I could use this day, our 5th wedding anniversary, to rekindle our relationship and our marriage, but that hope was crushed by her attitude. 5th wedding anniversary gifts are traditionally made of wood, but I realized she couldn't give a wooden nickel for our marriage. It's a strange expression I picked up from an American movie. Movie, a few years ago. Unfortunately, the expression turned out to be very apartment I had already bought her a necklace with an absolutely exquisite gemstone, which was a skillfully polished piece of petrified wood suspended from a solid gold chain. Together, they cost me about £350. However, the shocked look of guilt on her face when I handed it to her in the restaurant, along with a special 5th anniversary card that I spent about an hour choosing and a bottle of Taittinger Comte de Champagne Blanc de Blanc 2002, it cost me over £200, was priceless. Oops, guess what? She didn't buy me anything for our anniversary, not even a fucking greetings card from ASDA, which pretty much confirmed my assumption that she was going to use at least one of Paul Simon's 50 Ways to Dump a Lover against me. And pretty soon, IA, her ex-lover. Because now I knew, or rather, I had come to terms with the fact that although I was her lover, she was no longer my lover. And that was me. I loved my separatrix, but she didn't know that I knew that was her end. Well, maybe it was her thing. Does she have someone else already? Or someone she's already romantically involved with? Or even someone she's already playing hide-and-seek with? The lack of any intimacy in our relationship lately has struck me as very telling. Most likely a yes to any of these options because Louise was risk-averse. That's why I was so shocked at the thought of her cheating on me, because it was unlike her, the Louise I'd had time to get to know and love. Or maybe, in the 8 years we'd been together, she'd only let me see what she wanted me to see, and if that was the case, then honestly it was depressing as hell. Like I said, the lack of any intimacy in our relationship was hurting me. Yeah, it did. It hurt. It was pretty chilly in bed that night, even though it was the middle of summer. The next morning, I did what I always do in times of crisis. I called my good friend Carol and invited her over for coffee. No! Get your mind out of your head, how dare you! Carol and I had been best friends since our early teens, and, although we went to the school prom together, we had never dated as such. The then principal of the school had seen Grease at the local movie theater and decided that what appeared on the big screen depicting 1950s America would be appropriate for a British secondary modern school in the late 1970s, so she organized a school prom. By the time Carol and I arrived at the school a few years later, the previous principal had long since left for a villa in Portugal or Spain, and left her mark because the school was renamed Daphne Barker School in her honor, and that was before she died, which is almost unheard of in Britain. They usually like to name things after dead people. And the school prom is still a big part of the school's schedule today. Where the hell have I been? Oh, yeah. Despite the fact that Carol and I had been buddies for ages, we never thought about going to bed together. Well, I did, and she didn't because she was 100% lesbian. She let me down very gently by telling me that if she ever became straight, she would be straight for me. So there you go. Not only did she very gently let me go, but she made me smile at the same time, so our relationship continued to be purely platonic. It just so happened that she was in between romantic relationships at that moment. We met at our favorite coffee shop, the Costa branch on High Street, not the one in the retail park. I got my usual coffee, a salted caramel crunch with cream and a portion of coffee, and Carol got her usual, a caramel cortado. She looked at me and said, "Okay, Mike, what's wrong?" "I think Louise is cheating on me." She took a sip of her drink and visibly pondered for a few seconds before answering. "Why do you think that?" I told her about the indifference, the lack of sexual intimacy, well, any intimacy to be honest, the ridicule, the lack of even a card for our anniversary, and the constant singing, whistling, or humming of 50 Ways to Dump a Lover. I vaguely hoped Carol would tell me off for thinking too much and being an idiot, but instead she patted me on the arm and said sympathetically, "Well, that's not too good, is it?" When I was studying to be a psychology major, one of my professors asked us to read non-scientific mystery stories by the American science fiction writer Professor Isaac Asimov. At first I didn't like the idea, but he insisted, saying that Asimov's mystical stories would be useful to me in my study of psychology, and to my surprise, I found that he was right. The only story that has anything to do with it, well, tangentially I suppose, is the mystery story Yankee Doodle Went to Town, in which a suspect under duress during interrogation hummed the old American tune, Yankee Doodle Went to Town, because it contained a clue to the case under investigation. I think Louise is involuntarily humming 50 Ways to Dump Your Lover because she's seriously thinking about dumping you, or in a sense has already left you. However, I can't be sure if she's thinking about leaving you or even, at worst, actually cheating on you until I see her for myself. As you know, after earning a degree in psychology and then a master's, my doctorate focused on the applied use of body language, and if this cow is cheating on you, I will be able to determine that by observing her interactions with you. Obviously, we'll all have to be together, but we can do that tonight if I stop by on one of my impromptu visits. I happen to owe Louise a couple of prescriptions, and when we sit and have a drink, I can observe her behavior and report back to you tomorrow. I thanked her for her help. She nodded, finished her coffee, and stood up, giving me a brief hug. "Look, I hope it's nothing and she's not cheating on you, okay?" We hugged, parted with a brief kiss, and I headed back to my office. Being self-employed and not having to answer to anyone had its advantages. In the evening, Carol brought the recipes, and Louise and I shared a bottle of good wine from Halfpenny Green Winery in the West Midlands. We had bought some mixed cases by mail order, and in that bottle was a nice white wine called Black Country Gold. I tried to normalize the evening by buying some snacks on the way home, as I often did when Carol came over and we had classic FM on in the background. In passing, I noticed that the presenter that evening was John Suchet, brother of David Suchet, an actor famous for portraying Agatha Christie's Hercule Poirot particularly well. When I'm stressed or upset, I find that my mind doesn't wander, but is focused like a laser on the inconsequential minutiae of life. Wine, the radio host, his brother. Who cares, right? But that's how I deal with shitty situations. Despite everything I suspected was going on, we had a good evening, and out of the corner of my eye, I noticed Carol watching Louise very closely. Louise, however, didn't notice anything. So much so that she was humming 50 Ways to Leave a Lover to herself, much to Carol's delight. We said goodbye to Carol at 10 o'clock that evening, and by 11 o'clock, Louise and I were in bed. She must have fallen asleep almost immediately, but me? Sleep didn't come so easily. Strangely enough, the next morning, Louise was out of the house before I woke up. I vaguely remembered her mentioning something about an early staff meeting at the school where she taught. I took a shower, had a hasty breakfast, and headed to my office, which was on the high street a few steps away from my favorite Cafe Costa. As soon as I entered the office, my phone beeped to let me know that I had received a text message. It was from Carol. Could I meet her as soon as possible, please, at the Costa? I answered in the affirmative, setting the appointment for 9 o'clock, which gave me plenty of time to go through my email and answer a couple of important emails. When I arrived at the Costa, Carol had already brought our drinks and had taken a table as far away from the windows as possible. Hey, Mike, listen, let's not beat around the bush. Having watched Louise closely last night, I have to say that I'm 99% sure she's cheating on you. All the signs of body language were there. Negative cluster cues, the way she was dismissive of you, but very subtle, or so she thought. Plus, she didn't seem to like PDA, public displays of affection. I mean, she's usually very affectionate with you if we're all together. But what she did last night looked fake. Like she had to force herself to be normal with you. And humming that fucking tune, how did she do that? What the hell was that? And she couldn't look you in the eye like she was ashamed of something. My shoulders slumped. I'd been afraid, expecting bad news from Carol about Louise, but hoping my suspicions were wrong. But they weren't. Carol walked over to me and gave my hand a brief squeeze. I know, Mike, I know. You wanted me to be able to tell you that your suspicions were unfounded. I'm sorry I couldn't do that for you. I smiled at her, probably weakly, but it was the best I could do. Carol, I'm just grateful that you were able to help me. Without your help, I wouldn't have realized anything. I'm so glad you had the skills and abilities to help me. What are you going to do next, Mike? I'm going to hire a private investigator to find out who she's having an affair with. You don't know any private investigators, do you? I grinned to let her know I was just kidding. She realized my joke and said, Sorry, I don't know any. You'll have to Google or troll them. I laughed at her joke about spoonerisms. Spoonerisms was a joke we shared that dated back to our childhood friendship. We'd seen an episode of the Two Ronnies show when Ronnie Barker portrayed the 19th century academic Dr. William Spooner, and we'd been making up spoonerisms now and then for years. Louise was always annoyed by it. Well, to hell with it, bitch. I will, I said. We parted ways, and back in my office, I set about finding private investigators in our town. This turned out to be not as easy as it seemed. Some of the local private investigators listed, despite their claims, weren't actually local. They were national firms masquerading as local. One ship of fools had what they described as blogs for their local offices, which were exactly the same word-for-word blog entries for all 50 of their so-called local offices. It's even more pathetic when they all appear on the same site. A few others seemed like the fantasies of people who watched the Magnum P.I. series as kids. I was about ready to give up when I spotted an ad for Digestive Investigations. They had a real local address that was only 2 streets away from my office. I called them and luckily got an appointment for the afternoon. Apparently, they had a cancellation. Someone else's loss, my gain, I thought to myself. I was at the detective office at 3 in the afternoon and met with the director, former Detective Sergeant Jeff Lithgow. He told me that he had spent 24 years in the local police force, starting as a cadet at the local police college, becoming a constable at 18 and being promoted to sergeant at 26. A year later, he became a detective sergeant. Although he passed his inspector's exams, his promotion proved difficult, as priority for promotion was given to recruits who, as university graduates, had been accepted under the fast-track promotion program and were promoted over his head. He managed to haggle a redundancy offer that practically protected his pension, and he quit to start his own agency just after his 40th birthday. Now, 5 years later, he has hired, on a freelance basis, several of his former colleagues and one former Royal Military Police officer who rose to the rank of captain in the Special Investigations Unit, plus a technician, a covert surveillance expert who still worked for the local police. Jeff had me sign a contract between Detective and myself and asked for an upfront payment of £500, which we deposited using the SumUp card reader on his desk. He also asked me to fill in a questionnaire about Louise. He scanned a photograph of Louise, which he asked me to bring, and printed out a copy which he attached to the questionnaire. Then he told me what was on his mind. I propose, Mr. Collins, that you allow us to install surveillance devices in your home to find out what your wife is doing. Installing monitoring software on your wife's cell phone is technically possible, but I would not do it because it is illegal under Section 1 of the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act 2000. However, placing surveillance devices, video cameras, and the like in your home is perfectly legal as long as we have your written permission to do so. He handed me another set of forms, which I signed and returned to him. Your wife works as a teacher at Joan Ross Academy, you say? I assume she works there from 8:30 a.m. to 3 p.m.? About that, although she tends to work irregular hours. Sometimes she starts at 8 in the morning and sometimes earlier. Sometimes she finishes before 5 or even 7 in the evening. For parent-teacher nights, she has to go back to school. Sometimes she doesn't get home until 10 o'clock at night. He nodded. Say tells me you run your own marketing agency, so I assume you set your own schedule? Since that's the case, I suggest that Dave, my technician, meet with you tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. and bug your home. I agreed. We shook hands and I sort of wandered away from his office, embarrassed and saddened by what I was being forced to do. However, in the back of my mind, I was still plagued by doubts. What if she wasn't cheating on me? What if she was terminally ill or something and didn't want to tell me? That she left for the 51st reason, which Paul Simon didn't mention, but which came through in that slightly darker but still heartbreaking Honey song. I wondered how I was going to face Louise that evening, but as she had, as usual lately, pretty much ignored me, I decided that ignoring her in return would be pretty easy. The next morning, a little over an hour after Louise had left for work, a medium-sized van pulled up to the house. It sported a lightning bolt and a sign that read, Broadband Solutions. Dave introduced himself and nodded towards the van, saying, An unmarked van, in my experience, always arouses suspicion from nosy neighbors. That's why we always opt for a marked van. In the old days, the police used transit vans painted in the old yellow postal phone colors, appropriately marked. Some officers didn't like it, mainly left-wing union agitators, so our colleagues from Special Branch came to see them and their managers, and that put an end to that nonsense. Anyway, sir, I'd be very pleased if you could find some important business to occupy yourself in the garden. I'll tell you when I've finished. This is to ensure that you don't know where the cameras are hidden, and you won't be tempted to peep into them, as some people do, risking disrupting the operation. I nodded absent-mindedly and went to sit in the garden. I had a few garden chores to attend to, but with a possible divorce looming, I didn't want to bother, to be honest. After 40 minutes, he opened the back door, came out and quietly said, I'm done. The surveillance devices are in the kitchen, living room, hallway, stairwell, and all 3 bedrooms. I've checked them. They all work and are transmitting a signal to our office. Good luck finding peace of mind, sir. We shook hands and he left. And he was right. Across the road, a curtain clinker watched his departure. Maybe they wanted to change Virgin's shabby broadband service? Can't say I blame them. I headed for my office. Suddenly staying at home didn't seem as tempting as it had before. 3 days. 3 days was all it took to destroy my last hope that Louise wasn't cheating on me. Not my Louise, she could never be so cruel. Oh yes, she could. In fact, she could be far more cruel than I could ever imagine. And not just towards me, as it turned out. On the afternoon of that 3rd day, Wednesday, I think, well, I know. How could I forget that Wednesday? I got a text message from the detective. It read, Unfortunately, confirmation has been received. Please visit us as soon as possible. Respect and sympathy, Jeff. Damn it. Confirmation. I sent Carol a quick text message and then walked the couple minutes to the agency office. I couldn't drive. At least I somehow doubted I didn't have the ability to drive. I'd crash or something. Jeff's secretary ushered me into the office where Jeff sat at his desk, looking somber. I sat down and waited for him to speak. I'm afraid this is not good news, but you need it. It's true, your wife is cheating on you. But the guy she's having an affair with is old enough to be her father, even her grandfather. I was puzzled. What, but who? Not her stepfather, Tony? Jeff shook his head. No, we managed to get the name of her lover. He's American, as I said, and much older than her. His name is William Gentry. I involuntarily sighed in horror. Shit! William fucking Gentry? You know him? Jeff sounded tense. Yes. Or rather, I know of him. He's her birth father. The bastard sexually abused Louise when she was 19, celebrating her 19th birthday. Louise's mother caught them together. As I was told, he admitted to coercing her, and to save Louise from having to go to court, it was decided that Gentry would crawl away to the States, where he was from, and never return to Britain again. Apparently, the bastard changed his mind and came back. Jeff shook his head. If they're in a consensual relationship, and they are, then I doubt very much that the sexual assault story could be true, which is actually what the tapes of the conversations we received confirm. What they are doing is very illegal, and such cases are taken very seriously in our courts. Both participants and willingly usually get prison sentences. I still have some connections with the local police. Would you like me to report them to the police? I nodded in agreement. Shit, that was awful. Louise's poor mother, Jane, and her stepfather, Tony. How would this affect them? And to find out that he hadn't sexually assaulted Louise all those years ago? That they'd had a consensual affair even then? Oh, God. I'm going to have to tell Jane. I cleared my throat before I spoke again. I'm going to have to tell Jane, Louise's mother and her stepfather, and then I'm going to divorce that two-faced bitch. He stood up, shook my hand, and said, No nonsense, okay? Everything has to be legal. I know you might be tempted to get back at them physically, but don't do anything you'll regret later, okay? I promised him I wouldn't and walked out of his office. I called Carol and asked if I could meet her at her cute little Muse cottage downtown. Fortunately, she works from an office in her home. So it happened. A quarter of an hour after that, I was sitting in Carol's living room telling her the whole sordid story and crying while doing so. Carol bellowed, You rotten, conniving little bitch! When I remember after you introduced me to her, she was telling me about her father who attacked her. Damn! Now it all makes sense. At the time, I thought her stories about him were too corny. I figured it was because, as a victim of assault, she was using dissociation techniques to psychologically detach herself from the trauma. But instead, it turned out she was lying. Bitch. Shit. Is it possible that I believed her because I wanted to believe her? Because I saw no reason why a woman would lie about something like that? Believe every woman, for fuck's sake! She looked at me. Anyway, it doesn't matter now. What are you going to do? I'm going to divorce the bitch, and the matter of their ongoing affair is now out of my hands. It's been referred to the police. Damn good job, Carol said. Fucking perverted bastards. Despite being a psychologist, Carol had some pretty firm and not so liberal views on life. I looked at her for a moment before I spoke. I'll have to go and see Jane and Tony. Let them know what's going on. What's been happening. God, what a mess. Carol looked at me and said, I'll go with you. I don't want you to go through this ordeal alone. You need support, and I'm someone who can and will be happy to give it to you. After all, considering how much support you've given me over the years, it's only right that I return the favor. We went to the nice little house Jane lived in with her husband, Tony. I will never forget the cry of horror that came out of Jane's mouth. She began to sob, clinging to Tony, who looked almost as shocked and devastated as Jane. We comforted them as best we could. As we got into Carol's car, she said, As you know, my younger brother is a lawyer. He will be able to sort out the divorce for you. Moreover, I will have him prepare all the documents quickly. I will ask him to file them in court. What a bloody mess she's made, damn her. And if you want, you can stay in my spare room. I accepted Carol's offer of help with great gratitude. I didn't think it was possible, but Jeff Lithgow must have had a lot of influence with the local police because both Louise and William Gentry were arrested the same day. They were charged with incest. He managed to get a semi-legal copy of the security camera footage of Louise's arrest. Louise Collins? Yes. What is it, officer? I'm Detective Constable Paul Richards from the Sexual and Serious Crime Unit at Midshires Police. This is my colleague, PC Sandra Jones. I am arresting you on suspicion of committing an act with William Gentry, your father. You don't have to say anything, but it may harm your defense if you don't mention things in questioning that you will later rely on in court. Anything you say can be cited in evidence. Louise slumped against the door, staggering, with an expression of utter bewilderment on her face. Jeff called me and told me what had happened, emailing me the video file just 45 minutes after the arrest. Apparently, William Gentry's arrest did not go without incident, as he decided to play dumb with the police and was arrested for incest, assaulting a police officer, and resisting arrest. Louise was released on bail fairly quickly, but William Gentry spent some time in police custody, the idiot. Taking advantage of Louise's absence from the house, I gathered some clothes and belongings and took them to Carol's. The next few weeks passed like a blur, to be honest. I guess I was in shock. Well, what young, fit, and virile man in his early 30s would want to find out that his wife was having an affair with her own father, who was in his late 70s? I had Paul, Carol's younger brother, handle the divorce, and the affair case was handled by the Crown Prosecution Service, and the judge really came down on them in his verdict after the jury found them guilty. Your barrister argued that your crime was a victimless crime. I have to say that simply cannot convince me. You both cheated on your spouses. You, Mr. Gentry, years ago. You, Mrs. Collins, more recently. You have both caused them irreparable harm with your so-called victimless crimes. Incest is a crime with wider implications. It strikes at the very moral fabric and structure of our society. Incest is a crime that must be eradicated and punished when it is discovered, and it must be punished with due severity. It gives me no pleasure, but you must be punished for what you have done. I therefore sentence you both to 2 years in prison, and I strongly recommend that Mr. Gentry be deported as soon as he has served his sentence. The trial was adjourned because cases in the Crown Courts can take several years to be heard, but their case took only 6 months. I filed for divorce on the grounds of her adultery with her own father, which caused a bit of a stir in the tabloid press, which picked up the story. I thought perhaps Louise would object or raise a fuss, but she didn't bother. She also made no attempt to apologize to me or even talk to me after the arrest. So it was a case of just slip out the back door, Jack, make a new plan, Stan, and I was just forgotten about and sidelined. She gave her mother some sort of half-joking apology. Apparently, she and William had been secretly communicating all these years, but his last relationship in the U.S. had broken down. His common-law wife had found letters between him and Louise, and he had decided to return to the UK and resume their illicit relationship. They had some vague idea that she would file for divorce from me on the grounds of unreasonable behavior, but she didn't figure out how to engineer the situation to portray that I was being unreasonable, and then I discovered her cheating and filed for divorce on the grounds of cheating with her own father, which ruined their plans in a heartbeat. The divorce was a foregone conclusion given the fact that at the time of the divorce hearing, she was already in jail and therefore for adultery with her own father. I had to give evidence during the adultery trial, and to my surprise, the defense barrister, who went by the unlikely name of Mr. Jolly, they had one barrister, asked me what it was like for me to be a cuckold to my wife and her father. Before I could formulate an answer for which I would not be thrown out of court, the judge banged his gavel 3 times. The look on his face expressed extreme rage. Members of the jury, please disregard this disgraceful question from Mr. Jolly, defense counsel. Mr. Jolly, I find you in contempt of court, and I am fining you £500. Mr. Jolly blushed, stammered, apologized, and the instructing lawyer firmly poked him in the back and began reprimanding him, quietly but vehemently. After the divorce, the house was sold, and we split the property 50/50ths. There was no alimony, but apparently the teaching regulation agency didn't want to allow a man with a conviction for incest and a subsequent prison sentence to work as a teacher after he got out of prison. Oh, that's a shame, isn't it? Obviously, gloating is wrong. Tough. I bought a nice 2-bedroom house around the corner from Carol's house, and Carol arranged for me to get counseling from a friend of hers. Carol's friend was also working with Jane and Tony, counseling them. As for me, counseling helped me deal with my pain and heartbreak. The bastard's remark about me being their cuckold hurt me more than I intended, but I was helped to realize that it was actually a love affair that had destroyed our marriage. And I was young enough to start dating again if I had enough time, and the world was my oyster, in all likelihood. As for Louise, she actually only served just over a year of her sentence, probably because HMP Holloway Prison was closing in 2016 and wanted to reduce its population before sending prisoners to the remaining women's prisons. William Gentry was in London's Pentonville prison, and after serving 18 months, he was deported back to the U.S. To his dismay, Louise did not follow him back to the States. Actually, I think the incest conviction put a stop to that part of their plan, since foreigners with a criminal record are not usually accepted in the U.S. Jeff insisted that I familiarize myself with the wiretap transcript, and that made me feel better in some ways. He and William spent a lot of time talking, and Louise told him that she felt bad about what she had done to me, that I didn't deserve it because I was a good person, but she couldn't let it get in the way of her one true love with William. Oddly enough, neither of them seemed to give a second thought to Jane, Louisa's mom, which made me very sad. After all, Jane had birthed and raised her, and in Louisa's strange world, it was as if she no longer existed. Could I have taken more revenge on them? Well, yes, I suppose I could. But that would bring me down to their level, and I'd risk going to prison myself. Because I know that if I let my imagination run wild, it wouldn't end well for them or me. So I'll have to settle for jail time for incest, divorce for adultery, deportation, and the fact that Laos will never be able to get a teaching job again. What a shame! What a shame! We have to wrap this up. I'm going to shower and shave, horrible 5 o'clock shadow, before heading out on a date with a girl I met when we were both trying to decide what fresh vegetables to buy at our local Lidl store. It's funny how things work out. I guess there are 50 ways to meet a lover.